Millions of people around the world know this building. They know it as Downton Abbey, the fictional home of the Crawley family, where earls fretted over dinner seating and footmen polished the silver. But the real story of Highclere Castle makes the fiction look tame. Because the woman who ruled this house was not born to the aristocracy. She was purchased into it. Her father was one of the richest men in England, her birth certificate was a lie, and her dowry was worth £80 million in today's money. She funded the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, turned her castle into a hospital, confessed to adultery under oath, and died choking on a chicken stew in a terraced house in Bristol. Her name was Almina. They called her the Pocket Venus. Chapter 1. The Girl with the Wrong Father. In 1876, a baby girl was born in Mayfair, whose birth certificate told a careful, deliberate lie. The document named her father as Frederick Womwell, a minor figure in London society, a man of modest means and modest reputation, a man who happened to be married to the baby's mother, Marie Boyer. On paper, everything looked perfectly ordinary. A married couple, a healthy child, a respectable address. But Frederick Womwell was not the father. Everyone who mattered knew it. The real father was Alfred de Rothschild, and his name could never appear on any official record. Not because he was a criminal or a fugitive, but because he was unmarried, because Marie Boyer was another man's wife, and because the scandal of acknowledging the child would have shaken one of the most powerful banking dynasties in history. Alfred de Rothschild was not simply rich. He existed on a plane of wealth that most people in Victorian England could not begin to imagine. The Rothschild family had financed nations. They lent the British government £4 million to buy the Suez Canal in 1875, the year before Almina was born. They owned 7 country houses in a single valley in Buckinghamshire, a concentration of private wealth so dense that the local villages existed essentially as service economies for the family. Alfred himself kept a private orchestra at his estate, Halton House, not a string quartet for after dinner, a full circus band that performed while he ate breakfast. He collected art the way other men collected stamps. Old masters hung in rooms that were themselves works of art, gilded and mirrored in the French style he loved. He employed a valet whose sole job was to tend to his collection of walking sticks. His carriages were painted in his racing colors. His gardens at Halton were designed to rival Versailles, and some visitors thought they succeeded. This was the man who could not put his name on a birth certificate. The arrangement was Victorian in its precision. Frederick Womwell would serve as the official father, Marie Boyer would raise the child, Alfred would provide the money, all of it. The child would want for nothing except the truth. She would be educated, clothed, housed, and loved, but always at a distance from the man who paid for everything, always behind a wall of respectable fiction. The girl was named Almina Victoria Marie Alexandra Womwell. The string of names was itself a clue. Victoria, Marie, Alexandra, the names of queens and mothers. As if the weight of borrowed grandeur could somehow fill the gap where a father's surname should have been. Almina grew up knowing luxury, but not lineage. She had the best of everything: French governesses, music lessons, fashionable clothes. Alfred visited. He was fond of her. Some accounts say he was devoted, but fondness is not the same as acknowledgement, and devotion conducted through a false surname carries its own particular cruelty. She was small, barely 5 feet tall, dark-haired, dark-eyed, with a vitality that people noticed the moment she entered a room. She was not a beauty in the classical Victorian sense. She was something more difficult to categorize. Vivid, forceful, the kind of woman who made a room feel smaller simply by standing in it. The nickname came later, but it suited her from the start. The Pocket Venus. Tiny, beautiful, and impossible to ignore. She lived in a strange twilight. She moved through the Rothschild world, attended its parties, breathed its rarefied air, but she was always on the other side of the glass. Alfred's legitimate relations knew about her. Some were kind, others were correct, which is the English way of being unkind without raising your voice. Almina learned early to read a room, to sense the difference between genuine welcome and polite tolerance. It was a skill that would serve her well. It was also a wound that would never heal. By the time she was 18, Alfred had a problem. His daughter needed a future. She needed a husband, a position, a name that would carry weight in the world she had been raised to inhabit but had no right to enter. And Alfred de Rothschild, who had spent his life solving problems with money, reached for his checkbook one more time. The question was not whether he could find her a husband. Money of that magnitude could always find a willing partner. The question was the price, and the answer when it came would be staggering. Chapter 2, £500,000 for a title. The 5th Earl of Carnarvon needed money so badly he was willing to marry a girl whose real father could never be named. George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert was 29 years old in 1895, and he was drowning, not in water, in debt. The 5th Earl had inherited Highclere Castle and its 5,000 acres of Hampshire parkland. But inheritance in the late Victorian age was not the windfall it appeared. The land was magnificent. The house was extraordinary, a Gothic revival palace designed by Sir Charles Barry, the same architect who built the Houses of Parliament. The estate employed over 100 people, and it was bleeding money faster than the rents could replenish it. The agricultural depression of the 1880s had crushed the income of every landed family in England. Wheat prices had halved, tenant farmers could not pay their rents. The great estates, built on the assumption that English soil would always generate English wealth, found themselves owning vast acreages of diminishing value. Highclere was no exception, but the 5th Earl had problems beyond agriculture. He was a gambler. He loved horse racing. He kept a yacht. He lived at a pace that assumed the money would never run out, even as it was running out. His debts were considerable, his lifestyle was unsustainable, and his ancestral home needed repairs that he could not afford. Enter Alfred de Rothschild with a proposition that was less a marriage proposal than a corporate merger. The terms were breathtaking. Alfred would settle £500,000 on the couple. He would provide an annual income of £12,000. He would clear every one of the Earl's existing debts. In return, his daughter would become the Countess of Carnarvon. She would have a title, a castle, and a position in the highest reaches of English society. Consider the scale of that settlement, £500,000 in 1895. A footman at Highclere earned £20 a year. A scullery maid, the lowest member of the household staff, earned less than 14. A skilled farm laborer might earn 40. The settlement Alfred offered was worth 25,000 times a footman's annual wage. A working man would have needed 5,000 years of unbroken labor to accumulate what Alfred handed over in a single transaction. In today's money, the total package was worth roughly £80 million. For a name on a marriage certificate, the sheer scale of the transaction was unusual even by the standards of aristocratic marriages. The late Victorian era was awash with transactional unions. American heiresses, the so-called dollar princesses, were crossing the Atlantic in droves, swapping railroad fortunes and steel millions for titles and crumbling estates. Consuelo Vanderbilt married the Duke of Marlborough. Mary Leader married Lord Curzon. The traffic was so brisk that society papers ran columns tracking the latest deals. But even in this marketplace, the Carnarvon settlement stood out. Alfred was not buying his daughter a baronet or a viscount. He was buying her an earldom, one of the oldest in the country, attached to one of the finest houses in England. The price reflected the product. The wedding took place on the 26th of June, 1895, at St. Margaret's Church, Westminster, the same church where Samuel Pepys had been christened and where Winston Churchill would later marry. Almina was 19. The Earl was 29. The congregation was glittering. The settlement was signed. The transaction was complete. What Almina felt on that day is lost to us. The historical record preserves the financial details with great precision, because money leaves a trail that emotions do not. We know the exact sum, we know the terms, we know the date. What we cannot know is whether the 19-year-old girl who walked up the aisle at St. Margaret's felt joy, or relief, or the quiet terror of a woman who understood that she had been bought, because that is what happened. The language of the era dressed it in silk and flowers and church bells, but the structure was naked. Money had been exchanged for status. An illegitimate daughter had been laundered into the aristocracy through a ceremony, a signature, and £500,000. The Earl got what he needed. Alfred got what he wanted. And Almina got a castle, a title, and a lifetime of proving that she deserved both. She would spend the next 50 years trying. Chapter 3. The Countess who conquered Highclere. Within 12 months of her wedding, Almina had electricity installed, royalty at her dinner table, and every servant in the house terrified of her. She arrived at Highclere as an outsider, 19 years old, barely 5 feet tall. The daughter of a man whose name she could not speak. The staff knew. The neighbors knew. The county families who came to call and left their cards in the silver tray in the entrance hall, they knew too. The new Countess of Carnarvon had been purchased, and in the drawing rooms of Hampshire, that was a fact that would take more than money to overcome. Almina overcame it by force of will. The house she inherited was grand, but dated. Highclere had gaslight and candles. It had draughts that moved through the corridors like uninvited guests. It was a house built for spectacle, not comfort, and Almina wanted both. Within her first year, she ordered the installation of electric lighting throughout the principal rooms. She modernized the kitchens. She redecorated. She spent money with a confidence that startled the household staff, who were accustomed to the careful economies of an estate in financial difficulty. But spending was only the beginning. Almina understood something that many aristocratic wives never grasped. The house was not just a home. It was a stage, and the performance she gave on that stage would determine whether she was accepted or forever dismissed as the Rothschild girl who married above her station. She threw herself into the role of hostess with an energy that bordered on ferocity. The Edwardian era was the golden age of the country house weekend, and Almina made Highclere one of its brightest centers. The guest lists read like a roll call of power. Politicians, diplomats, soldiers, writers, Edward VII himself, that great connoisseur of hospitality, and other men's wives came to stay. When the king visited, the entire household mobilized. The silver was polished until it burned. The menus were planned weeks in advance. Every flower arrangement was scrutinized, every bedroom inspected, every detail weighed against the standard of perfection that Almina imposed on herself and everyone around her. The house parties lasted from Friday to Monday. Guests arrived by train at Highclere Station and were met by carriages. Their luggage was unpacked by their own valets and ladies' maids, who joined the existing army of Highclere servants in a complex hierarchy of borrowed status. A duke's valet outranked an earl's. A marchioness's maid ate at a different table from a baroness's. The rules were intricate, unwritten, and absolute. Almina presided over this world as if she had been born to it. She dressed impeccably. She conversed brilliantly. She managed the household accounts with a Rothschild's instinct for numbers and a spendthrift's disregard for limits. She was generous to a fault, tipping servants extravagantly, sending gifts to neighbors, funding local charities with the casual largesse of a woman who believed the money would never stop flowing. Highclere in these years was a palace of light and noise and excess. 30 indoor servants maintained the illusion of effortless perfection. Footmen in livery served meals of 8 or 9 courses. The wine cellar held thousands of bottles. The gardens employed a small army of their own. The stables housed horses for riding, hunting, and the Earl's beloved racing. The estate farms provided meat, dairy, and vegetables for the house, a self-contained economy in miniature, all of it paid for by Rothschild money channeled through a 19-year-old girl who had become, by sheer determination, one of the great hostesses of the Edwardian age. And then there was Egypt. The Earl had developed a passion for Egyptology. He spent winters abroad, partly for his health, partly for the thrill of excavation. Almina went with him. She arrived at the dig sites in the Valley of the Kings, dressed not in practical clothes but in jewels and silks, as if she were attending a garden party at Highclere rather than standing in the Egyptian dust. The archaeologists must have stared. She did not care. She had spent her whole life performing a role, and she was not about to stop in the desert. By 1914, Almina had been Countess of Carnarvon for nearly 20 years. She had a son, Henry, born in 1898. She had a daughter, Evelyn, born in 1901. She had a castle, a title, a position, and the admiration of everyone who visited her extraordinary house. She stood at the summit of English society, a place she had reached not by birthright, but by will and money and relentless, unstoppable energy. She did not know it yet, but the summit was about to crumble. A war was coming that would empty the great houses of their young men, drain their fortunes, and change the rules of the world she had fought so hard to master. And the first casualty of that change would be the very thing that had made her rise possible: the unlimited, inexhaustible Rothschild checkbook. #, Chapter 4. The accident that changed everything. In 1901, on a German road where the speed limit was higher than in England, the Earl of Carnarvon nearly killed himself. He was driving fast. He always drove fast. The fifth Earl loved motor cars with the same reckless enthusiasm he brought to horse racing and gambling, and on a road near Bad Schwalbach, that enthusiasm nearly ended his life. Accounts vary on the details, but the outcome is clear. The car swerved to avoid an obstruction, possibly a pair of oxen pulling a cart. It overturned. The Earl was pulled from the wreckage with serious injuries. His legs were damaged. His chest was crushed. His breathing was permanently compromised, a weakness that would shadow him for the rest of his life and 22 years later, kill him. He would never fully recover. The reckless young sportsman who had sailed yachts and ridden to hounds became a man who tired easily, who caught colds that turned to bronchitis, who could not survive an English winter without coughing through the nights. The doctors told him what doctors always told wealthy invalids in the early 20th century. Avoid the English winter. Find somewhere warm and dry. Rest. Egypt was warm. Egypt was dry. And Egypt, as it happened, was the place where everything would change. The Earl had dabbled in Egyptology before the crash, but his injuries turned a hobby into an obsession. He could no longer ride hard or drive recklessly or live the vigorous outdoor life of a country gentleman. What he could do was sit in the warm Egyptian sun and watch men dig. He could study. He could collect. He could pour money into the ground and hope that the ground would give something back. In 1907, he met Howard Carter. Carter was everything the Earl was not. Born in Kensington to a middle-class family, trained as an artist before he became an archaeologist, Carter was brilliant, difficult, proud, and perpetually short of money. He had worked in Egypt for years. He knew the Valley of the Kings better than almost any living European. He had served as chief inspector of antiquities in Upper Egypt before a dispute with a group of drunken French tourists led to his dismissal from that post. He was talented, experienced, prickly, and unemployable. What he needed was not an employer but a patron, someone who would give him money and leave him alone. The Earl was the perfect match. He had wealth. He had enthusiasm. He had enough knowledge to understand what Carter was doing and enough sense to let him do it. The partnership was formed in 1907, and for the next 15 years, Almina's Rothschild fortune flowed into the Egyptian sand. The cost was extraordinary. Each excavation season lasted from November to March, the only months when the heat was bearable. Carter required laborers, sometimes 200 at a time, paid daily wages to shift the sand and rock that covered the valley floor. He needed engineers and draughtsmen and photographers. He needed equipment, picks, shovels, baskets, rail carts to move debris. He needed permits from the Egyptian Antiquities Service, which charged fees and imposed conditions. The Earl's household in Egypt had to be maintained to a standard befitting a British peer, which meant servants, cooks, and all the apparatus of Edwardian comfort transplanted to the desert. A single season could cost several £1,000s. Multiply that by 15 years and the sum becomes breathtaking. Season after season, the money went in and very little came out. The Earl found tombs, but they had been robbed in antiquity. He found artifacts, but nothing of world-shaking importance. The bills mounted. The years passed. The sand swallowed the money and offered nothing in return but heat and dust and the quiet whisper of ancient dead. Back at Highclere, the real cost of this life was hidden behind green baize doors and below-stairs corridors. The great English country house was a machine, and Highclere was one of the largest machines in the country. To run it required between 30 and 60 indoor servants, depending on the season and the scale of entertainment. At the top stood the butler, who managed the male staff and controlled access to the wine cellar, the silver vault, and the front door. Below him, the footmen, tall, handsome young men selected partly for their looks, who served at table, answered bells, and carried messages. A first footman at Highclere earned perhaps £25 a year. A second footman earned slightly less. The female staff answered to the housekeeper, who ruled the linen cupboards, the still room, and the daily routine of the house with an authority that rivaled the Countess herself. Below the housekeeper came the ladies' maids, the housemaids, the kitchen maids, and at the very bottom, the scullery maids. Girls of 14 or 15 who woke before, dawn to scrub pots, black lead the grates, and carry hot water up back staircases that the family would never see. The architecture of the house enforced this invisibility. Highclere, like every great country house, was designed with two circulatory systems. The family moved through grand corridors and staterooms. The servants moved through narrow passages, back stairs, and underground tunnels. The two worlds occupied the same building, but were engineered never to meet. A footman caught in a family corridor during daylight hours faced dismissal. The illusion was that the house ran itself, that comfort appeared by magic, that fires lit themselves, and beds made themselves, and meals materialized from nowhere. The running cost of this illusion was staggering. The household wage bill alone exceeded £1,000 a year. Food, fuel, candles, soap, linen, uniforms, and repairs added thousands more. The gardens cost hundreds, the stables cost hundreds. The farms, which were supposed to generate income, frequently consumed it instead. And on top of all this, the Earl was spending thousands every season in Egypt, chasing a discovery that might never come. All of it, every penny, flowed from one source: Alfred de Rothschild's settlement, Almina's dowry. The price of a title stretched thinner and thinner across an empire of stone and sand. By 1914, the Earl had been digging in Egypt for 7 years. He had found interesting things, but nothing that justified the investment. His health was fragile. His fortune, which had seemed bottomless in 1895, was beginning to show its limits. And then, on the 28th of July, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination set in motion a chain of events that would bring the age of the country house to its knees. The Great War was coming. And Almina, characteristically, ran towards it. Chapter 5, the castle became a hospital. When the wounded began arriving at Highclere in 1914, Almina ordered her nurses to wear crushed strawberry pink and never appear without makeup. It was the most Almina detail imaginable. A battlefield hospital run on the principles of a Mayfair drawing room, the nurses in their elegant uniforms, the patients in beds with down pillows and linen sheets, the food prepared by the castle kitchen, not from army rations, but from the estate's own farms. It was extravagant and absurd, and by every measurable standard, it worked. Highclere was not the only country house to become a hospital during the Great War. Across England, the great estates opened their doors to the wounded, partly from patriotism, partly from social pressure, and partly because the government requisitioned them. But Almina's hospital was different. She did not merely offer her house. She ran it. She funded it. She imposed upon it a standard of care that was, by the standards of military medicine in 1914, revolutionary. The wounded arrived from the Western Front in states that modern readers can barely imagine: shattered limbs, gas burns, shrapnel wounds that had festered for days in the mud of Flanders. The standard military hospitals were overwhelmed, understaffed, and grimly utilitarian. Almina's hospital at Highclere was none of these things. She hired the best surgeons she could find. She equipped the operating theater with modern instruments. She insisted on cleanliness at a level that anticipated the infection control practices of a later era. The bed sheets were changed daily. The food was nutritious and plentiful. The patients, many of them ordinary soldiers who had never seen the inside of a castle, found themselves recovering in rooms where earls had once dined. The most remarkable innovation was a leg-splinting technique that Almina's medical team developed for compound fractures. Before their intervention, compound fractures of the femur carried a mortality rate of roughly 80%. The method they pioneered, involving careful splinting and sustained traction, reversed those odds dramatically. Soldiers who would have died in a standard field hospital walked out of Highclere. Almina was everywhere. She visited patients, she supervised the nurses, she bullied suppliers, charmed donors, and terrified anyone who fell below her standards. She was imperious and demanding and frequently impossible. She was also, by every account, genuinely compassionate. The combination was bewildering. She insisted that every nurse wear full makeup and the crushed strawberry pink uniform she had designed. She also sat by the beds of dying men and held their hands while they wept for their mothers. Over the course of the war, Highclere treated hundreds of wounded soldiers. The library became a ward. The drawing room became a recovery suite. The dining room became an operating theater. The transformation was total. A house built for pleasure was remade as a house of pain and healing, and the woman who presided over both versions was the same fierce, tiny, impossible countess who had arrived as a 19-year-old outsider 2 decades earlier. The patients came from every corner of the British Army, officers and other ranks alike, though the social distinctions of the era meant they were housed in different parts of the castle. The officers got the better rooms, the enlisted men got the converted public spaces, but everyone got the linen sheets, the fresh food, and the uncompromising medical care that Almina demanded. Letters home from soldiers recovering at Highclere read like dispatches from another planet. Men who had spent months in trenches filled with corpses and rats found themselves in a Gothic palace, eating roast beef and sleeping on feather mattresses, tended by nurses in pink uniforms who smelled of lavender instead of carbolic. Almina also opened a second facility in London at 48 Bryanston Square, treating the most severely wounded officers in a townhouse fitted out as a surgical recovery ward. She moved between the two hospitals with the energy of a general commanding twin campaigns. She kept meticulous records. She tracked every patient. She wrote to their families. The work was not glamorous. It was blood and stitches and screaming and the terrible sound of men crying in the dark. Almina did not flinch from any of it. But the money. Always, with Almina, the question returned to money. Every penny of the hospital's operation was paid privately. The government contributed nothing. The army contributed nothing. The cost fell entirely on Almina, and through her on Alfred de Rothschild. The bills were enormous. Surgeons' fees, nurses' salaries, medical supplies, food, laundry, heating, lighting, transport, hundreds of soldiers treated for months at a standard of care that no public hospital could match. The expense was ruinous. Alfred paid. He was old now, in his 70s, and the war had shaken him deeply. He was a German Jew by origin, and the conflict between England and Germany tore at loyalties he had spent a lifetime constructing. His art collection, his private concerts, his lavish hospitality, all of it suddenly seemed obscene in a country sending its young men to die in mud. But he paid for his daughter's hospital, as he had paid for everything else in her life, without limit and without complaint. The hospital alone cost him tens of thousands of pounds over the course of the war. It was, perhaps, the noblest use to which Rothschild money was ever put. On the 31st of January 1918, Alfred de Rothschild died at Halton House. He was 75. He left a substantial estate, but his will, when it was read, revealed a fortune diminished by decades of extraordinary generosity. He had given away millions. To Almina, to charities, to friends, to the war effort, to anyone who asked and many who did not. The private orchestra was silenced. The valet who tended the walking sticks was dismissed. The glass houses at Halton, which had grown orchids for his dinner table, fell into disuse. And Almina, who had spent 23 years drawing on a reservoir of wealth she treated as infinite, discovered that the reservoir had a bottom. Alfred left her money. But not what she had expected. Not what she needed. The annual allowance stopped. The casual top-ups that had covered her extravagance ceased. For the first time in her life, Almina had to live within limits. She was, constitutionally, incapable of doing so. The war ended in November 1918. The soldiers left Highclere. The house was restored, slowly and expensively, to something approaching its former state. But the world that Almina had conquered in the 1890s was gone. The men who had filled her guest lists were dead in Flanders. The servant class that had maintained the illusion of effortless grandeur was depleted and increasingly unwilling to return to service. The taxes were rising. The agricultural income was falling. The future, for every great country house in England, was dark. And in Egypt, Howard Carter was still digging. Chapter 6, Wonderful Things. And then death. By 1922, the Earl had spent a fortune digging in Egypt and found nothing that justified the expense. 15 years. 15 seasons of excavation in the Valley of the Kings. Thousands of pounds poured into the sand. Hundreds of laborers employed, supervised, and paid. Carter had found fragments, minor tombs, scattered artifacts, but the great discovery, the one that would vindicate the Earl's obsession and Almina's money, remained stubbornly buried. The Earl was tired. His health, never robust since the car crash of 1901, had deteriorated further. The post-war financial landscape was bleak. Death duties, introduced in 1894 and sharpened repeatedly in the years since, were devouring inherited wealth. The People's Budget of 1909 had targeted the landed aristocracy with new taxes on land values and unearned income. The Finance Act of 1910 had made those taxes permanent. The Earl could feel the ground shifting beneath his fortune, and the Egyptian excavations were an expense he could no longer easily afford. In the summer of 1922, he told Carter it was over. One more season. One final attempt. If this last campaign produced nothing, the digging would stop and the money would be redirected to the increasingly desperate task of keeping Highclere afloat. Carter went back to the valley. On the 4th of November 1922, a young Egyptian water boy, setting down his jars at the beginning of a day's work, scraped the sand and found a step cut into the rock. He called for Carter. Carter looked. Then he ordered the team to dig. By the next day, they had uncovered a staircase. By the end of the week, they had found a sealed doorway. Carter saw the seals of the royal necropolis. His hands were shaking. He ordered the staircase refilled, posted guards, and sent a telegram to the Earl in England. The telegram read, in the clipped language of the era, that he had found a magnificent tomb with seals intact. He urged the Earl to come at once. The Earl and his daughter Evelyn sailed for Egypt immediately. They arrived on the 23rd of November. Carter had waited. He had not opened the tomb. He had stood guard over the greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century and refused to look inside until his patron was present. It was an act of loyalty, of courtesy, and perhaps of showmanship. Carter understood the drama of what he had found. On the 26th of November, with the Earl standing behind him, Carter made a small hole in the upper corner of the sealed doorway. He pushed a candle through. The flame flickered in the escaping air, then steadied. He peered in. The Earl, standing in the corridor, asked the question that would echo through history. "Can you see anything?" Carter's reply, "Yes, wonderful things." What Carter saw through that hole was a room crammed with gold, gilded couches in the shape of animals, alabaster vases, painted caskets, overturned chariots. Statues of the king, life-sized, standing sentinel on either side of a sealed doorway that led, they would later discover, to the burial chamber itself. The treasure had been placed there more than 3,000 years earlier, in the reign of a boy king who died at roughly 19 years of age, and it had waited in the dark, untouched and perfect for Carter's candle to find it. The tomb of Tutankhamun, the most complete royal tomb ever found in Egypt, and it had been paid for. Every shovel load of sand, every worker's wage, every season's permit, by the Rothschild money that had entered the Herbert family through a marriage contract and an illegitimate daughter's dowry. The world went mad. The discovery made headlines on every continent. Carter and the Earl became the most famous archaeologists on Earth. The Earl sold exclusive coverage rights to the Times of London for £5,000. A decision that infuriated every other newspaper and generated a publicity storm that would not abate for years. But the Earl would not live to see the full excavation. In February 1923, while visiting the tomb, a mosquito bit the Earl on the cheek. It was a tiny wound. Meaningless, the Egyptian desert was full of mosquitoes, and every European who worked there suffered bites. But the Earl nicked the bite while shaving the following morning. The cut became infected. In the Egyptian heat, with the medical facilities of the era, infection moved fast. Blood poisoning set in. His temperature soared. The infection spread to his lungs, already weakened by the car crash 2 years earlier. Pneumonia followed. The doctors could do nothing. There were no antibiotics. Penicillin would not be widely available for another 20 years. The most powerful medicines in the world in 1923 were rest, fresh air, and hope, and none of them were enough. On the 5th of April 1923, at 1:50 in the morning, George Edward Stanhope Molyneux Herbert, 5th Earl of Carnarvon, died at the Continental Hotel in Cairo. He was 56 years old. His son Henry, the new 6th Earl, and his wife Almina were at his bedside. He had survived a car crash, a world war, and 15 years of fruitless digging in the desert. He did not survive a mosquito bite and a razor. The death was tragedy enough. But what followed was stranger. At the exact moment the Earl died, the lights went out across Cairo. A power failure, explained the electricity company. But the timing was too perfect for a press corps already addled by 3,000 years of Egyptian mysticism. The curse of Tutankhamun was born. Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of Sherlock Holmes and devoted spiritualist, declared that the Earl had been killed by elementals guarding the tomb. The popular press ran with it. Every subsequent death connected however tenuously to the excavation was attributed to the pharaoh's vengeance. The Lancet, Britain's most respected medical journal, offered a more sober assessment. The Earl died of erysipelas complicated by pneumonia. an entirely unremarkable infection in the age before antibiotics. The curse was nonsense. But it made better copy than medicine. Howard Carter, the man most exposed to whatever forces supposedly guarded the tomb, lived until 1939 and died at 64 of natural causes. The curse chose poorly if it was real, and not at all if it was not. Almina was a widow at 47. She had a castle, 2 children, a dwindling fortune, and a dead husband who had just made the most famous discovery in archaeological history. She also had, in the back of her mind, a plan that would prove more destructive than any ancient curse. She was about to remarry. And the man she chose would cost her everything. Chapter 7, the marriage that destroyed her. 8 months after burying the Earl of Carnarvon, Almina married a man who would cost her everything she had left. Lieutenant Colonel Ian Onslow Denistune was handsome, charming, and catastrophically unreliable. He was a military man of modest distinction and considerable debts. He had served in the Boer War and the Great War, acquiring the rank and manners of an officer without the income to sustain either. He had been married before, to a woman named Dorothy, from whom he was divorced. He owed Dorothy alimony that he had not paid. He owed other people money that he could not repay. He was the kind of man who entered a room with confidence and left it with your silverware. He was, by any rational assessment, a spectacularly poor choice of husband for a woman whose fortune was already under strain. Almina's friends, those who remained close enough to speak frankly, tried to warn her. Her children tried harder. But Almina had spent her entire life ignoring sensible advice, and she was not about to start following it now. There was a pattern in her character that the years had only deepened. She saw what she wanted to see. She believed what she wanted to believe. And what she wanted to believe in the winter of 1923 was that this man would give her the companionship, the stability, and perhaps the love that the 5th Earl, with his Egypt obsession and his fragile health, had not always provided. Almina did not care. She married him in December 1923, barely 8 months after the 5th Earl's death. The speed alone scandalized society. Widows were expected to mourn for at least a year, preferably 2. Almina could not wait. Whether she was driven by loneliness, by desire, or by the same reckless impetuosity that had characterized her entire life, the result was identical. She married a man who would bleed her dry. Those who knew Denistune were not surprised. He was the kind of man who could charm a drawing room and empty a bank account in the same afternoon. He had expensive tastes and no reliable income. He gambled. He borrowed. He lived on the assumption that someone else would always pay the bill. Before Almina, that someone had been his first wife, Dorothy. Now it was the former Countess of Carnarvon, with her Rothschild capital and her fatal inability to say no. The marriage settlement she provided was £100,000, a fortune by any standard. In 1923, a skilled worker in England earned roughly £3 a week. £100,000 represented over 600 years of labor at that wage. But this was not the careful, structured settlement that Alfred de Rothschild had negotiated in 1895. This was Almina's own money, handed over in haste to a man with a track record of losing it. There was no Alfred to oversee the terms, no Rothschild banker to structure the payments, just Almina, in love, writing cheques. The rupture with her family was immediate and devastating. Henry, the 6th Earl of Carnarvon, was 25 years old when his mother remarried. He had just inherited Highclere, the title, and the obligations that came with both. He also inherited the death duties triggered by his father's death, duties that in the post-war tax regime amounted to a punishing percentage of the estate's value. The government assessed the estate, tallied the land, the house, the art, the contents, and presented a bill that had to be paid in cash. Henry needed money. Almina was giving it to Denistune. Henry refused to accept the match. He was not alone. Almina's daughter Evelyn was also appalled. The family closed ranks against the marriage, and Almina, who had spent her life fighting for acceptance, found herself shut out by her own children. The breach between mother and son would never fully heal. For the rest of her life, Almina's relationship with her firstborn was strained, bitter, and marked by arguments about money. The son who should have been her greatest ally became a distant critic, and the castle that she had ruled for nearly 30 years passed out of her hands and into his. The financial picture was grim. The fifth Earl's death had triggered death duties of approximately 40% of the estate's taxable value. The agricultural income that had sustained Highclere for generations continued to decline. The servant class was shrinking. The great pre-war house parties were a memory. The cost of maintaining a house with over 300 rooms, 60 bedrooms, and acres of lead roofing was beyond the means of almost any private individual, and the sixth Earl was not a wealthy man. But the systemic forces bearing down on Highclere were bearing down on every great house in England. The landed aristocracy was being crushed by a fiscal regime that had been designed explicitly to crush them. The People's Budget of 1909 had been David Lloyd George's declaration of war on inherited privilege. He stood in the House of Commons and asked why a fully equipped duke cost as much to maintain as 2 dreadnoughts and was less easy to scrap. The Parliament Act of 1911 had broken the political power of the House of Lords, stripping the upper chamber of its ability to veto legislation from the Commons. The war had killed the sons. 1 in 5 of all Englishmen who served died, and the casualty rate among officers, drawn overwhelmingly from the landed classes, was higher still. The taxes had taken the money. The servant crisis had removed the workforce. Young women who had gone into munitions factories during the war discovered they could earn more in a week than a year in service, and they did not go back. The system that had sustained the English country house for centuries was collapsing, and the collapse was accelerating. Almina, characteristically, paid no attention to systems. She lived in the present tense, spending money she no longer had on a man who did not deserve it. Denistoone's debts consumed her capital. His lifestyle consumed her patience. His charm, which had dazzled her in the first months of marriage, wore thin under the weight of unpaid bills and broken promises. And his former wife Dorothy was about to consume her reputation. The bill was coming. It would be paid not in money, but in shame. Chapter 8, 17 Days of Shame. The trial that Punch magazine called the Dustbin Case forced Almina to confess, under oath, to adultery and financial deception. It began with Dorothy Denistoone's claim for unpaid alimony. Colonel Denistoone owed his former wife money. He had not paid. Dorothy sued. The case should have been a routine debt recovery, the kind of proceeding that filled the court lists and bored the barristers. But Dorothy's legal team realized that the real money was not Denistoone's. It was Almina's. And to reach Almina's money, they would have to prove that she had been directing the colonel's finances from behind the scenes. Almina made a catastrophic decision. She chose to fight. A wiser woman would have settled. A quieter woman would have paid Dorothy's claim, absorbed the cost, and kept the details out of the press. But Almina had never been wise in the ways that mattered, and she had never been quiet about anything. She believed she could win. She believed that her version of events, her interpretation of the money, her account of the marriage would prevail in court. She was wrong. She was ruinously, spectacularly, publicly wrong. The case came to trial in March 1925 before Mr. Justice McCarty. It lasted 17 days. Punch called it the Dustbin Case because of the filth that tumbled out. The press gallery was packed every day, reporters scribbling furiously as the most intimate details of aristocratic life were laid bare under oath. The public queue for seats stretched around the block. London had not seen a society scandal of this magnitude since the Mordaunt divorce case of 1870. Fleet Street was ecstatic. The public was riveted. Almina was doomed. What followed was a systematic destruction of Almina's carefully constructed public image. Under cross-examination, Almina was forced to admit that she had committed adultery during her first marriage to the Earl of Carnarvon. The name of her lover, or lovers, was dragged into the public record. In the context of the era, this was annihilation. A woman's reputation in 1920s England rested on a single foundation: sexual propriety. Everything else, intelligence, charity, courage, achievement, counted for nothing once that foundation cracked. Almina had hosted the king. She had saved soldiers' lives. She had funded the discovery of Tutankhamun. None of it mattered now. The woman who had spent 30 years building a reputation as a great hostess, a war heroine, and a devoted wife was exposed as having conducted affairs while married to the man whose title gave her everything. But the sexual revelations were only part of the damage. The financial disclosures were worse. Dorothy's lawyers demonstrated that Almina had channeled money through Dennistoun's accounts in ways designed to obscure its source and destination. She had paid his debts, funded his lifestyle, and arranged financial transactions that, while not technically illegal, showed a pattern of deception that was devastating in a courtroom. Cheques had been written, accounts had been opened and closed. Money had moved in circles designed to confuse anyone who tried to follow it. The image that emerged was of a woman who managed money with the same reckless generosity she had always shown, but who had moved from lavish openness to secretive manipulation. Norman Burkett, one of the finest barristers of his generation, represented Dorothy Denniston. His cross-examination of Almina was a masterclass in forensic destruction. He was polite. He was patient. He was merciless. He never raised his voice. He never needed to. He led her through the contradictions in her testimony with the quiet precision of a surgeon, laying each inconsistency beside the last until the cumulative weight was unbearable. By the end of 17 days, there was nothing left of her public facade. The judge found substantially in Dorothy's favor. Almina was ordered to pay costs and damages that totaled upward of £40,000. In 1925, £40,000 was the price of a large country estate. It was roughly what a senior barrister earned in a decade. For Almina, whose capital was already badly eroded, it was a blow from which her finances would never recover. But the true cost was not financial. It was social. Almina had been tried not for a crime, but for a character. The trial revealed an illegitimate woman who had bought her way into the aristocracy, committed adultery while enjoying the privilege of that position, and then attempted to hide her financial dealings behind a smokescreen of domestic loyalty. Every newspaper in England carried the story. The headlines were merciless. The cartoonists were worse. The popular press, which had spent years treating the aristocracy with a mixture of envy and reverence, turned on Almina with a particular savagery reserved for a woman who had fallen from a great height. Every drawing room in Mayfair discussed it. Every dinner table in the home counties debated it. The woman who had hosted kings was now the woman who had been exposed in the witness box. The social doors that had opened for her money closed against her character. The invitations stopped. The friendships cooled. The county families who had accepted her hospitality for 30 years discovered, with remarkable speed, that they had always found her a little too eager, a little too generous, a little too obviously bought. People who had eaten her food, drunk her wine, and slept in her beds suddenly remembered prior engagements. The cruelty was surgical and complete. Almina emerged from the trial financially damaged and socially destroyed. Dennistoun, the man for whom she had sacrificed her reputation, proved as useless as her friends had predicted. The marriage staggered on for a time, but the romantic illusion that had driven it was dead. They would separate eventually, though the details are murky. What is clear is that by the late 1920s, Almina was effectively alone again. Twice married. Twice disappointed. Once disgraced. She had fought the system that had accepted her money while despising her origins, and the system had won. Not through malice, though there was malice enough to go around, but through the cold machinery of law and public opinion, which could grant a woman status in a single afternoon and take it away in 17 days. What Almina did next was the most predictable thing in the world. She spent more money. #, Chapter 9, the last Rothschild penny. After the scandal, Almina did what she always did. She spent money she could no longer afford to reinvent herself. In 1927, she opened Alfred House, a private nursing home at Portland Place in London's West End. She named it after her father. There was defiance in the gesture, as if by putting Alfred de Rothschild's name above the door, she could reclaim something of the protection his money had always given her. The nursing home was, in its way, a return to what Almina did best. She had run a hospital at Highclere during the war. She understood medical care. She understood luxury. She understood the combination of the two. The peculiar alchemy of crisp linen, fresh flowers, and first-rate surgeons that could make even serious illness feel like a stay at a country house. Portland Place was expensive, exclusive, and immaculate. The rooms were decorated like bedrooms in a Mayfair townhouse. The food was prepared by a trained chef. The nursing staff were handpicked and beautifully dressed. Almina threw herself into it with the same ferocious energy she had brought to everything else in her life. Her patients included members of the aristocracy, politicians, and wealthy foreigners who appreciated discretion. Almina provided it. She also provided round-the-clock care, consultations with Harley Street specialists, and the kind of personal attention that made each patient feel like the only person in the building. It was bespoke medicine for the upper classes, and in the 1920s and 30s, there was a market for it. But the economics were different now. During the war, Alfred de Rothschild had underwritten every bill. Now there was no Alfred. There was only what remained of Almina's capital, and that capital was shrinking. She could not help herself. The old habits of generosity persisted. She treated patients who could not pay. She employed more staff than the business could support. She insisted on standards that were financially unsustainable. Down pillows, linen sheets, fresh flowers daily. The same perfectionism that had made Highclere magnificent now slowly bankrupted Portland Place. And then there were the impulses that had nothing to do with business. In the late 1920s, Almina funded an anti-malarial mission to Albania. It was a genuinely humanitarian act, driven by the same compassion that had motivated her wartime hospital. But it was also expensive, unplanned, and conducted with no regard for her diminishing resources. She paid for doctors. She paid for medicines. She paid for transport. The Albanian mission consumed money that the nursing home could not spare. The pattern was always the same. Almina saw a need. Almina spent money. The need was met. The money was gone. It was the story of her life compressed into a single repeating gesture, and it was slowly killing her. Through the 1930s, she moved the nursing home several times, chasing cheaper premises and trying to outrun her debts. From Portland Place to other London locations, each move a step down from the last. The patient lists grew shorter. The rooms grew smaller. The staff she could afford grew fewer. But Almina kept going. She had no other skill, no other identity, no other way of being in the world except the one she had always known, commanding a household, ordering the flowers, insisting on standards. Then came the Second World War. Again, the wounded needed beds. Again, Almina answered. She moved her operation to Hove on the Sussex coast, treating officers and soldiers in a facility that was a shadow of the wartime hospital at Highclere, but driven by the same fierce, compassionate will. Later, she moved again to Barnet in Hertfordshire. She was in her 60s now, then her 70s. The energy that had once lit up a Gothic castle was still burning, but the fuel was running out. Each facility was smaller than the last. Each budget was tighter. Each year brought her closer to the edge. The total Rothschild fortune that passed through Almina's hands across her lifetime was staggering. The original marriage settlement of £500,000, the annual income of £12,000 paid for over 20 years. The inheritance from Alfred, though smaller than expected. The various supplementary gifts, the cleared debts, the casual thousands that Alfred had given over decades of unconditional support. Conservative estimates put the total at well over £1 million in Victorian and Edwardian money, equivalent to hundreds of millions today. By some calculations, the figure approaches £2 million in period currency, and Almina spent it all. Every last shilling on Highclere, on Egypt, on hospitals, on Dennistown, on nursing homes, on Albania, on generosity and vanity, and the desperate, unending project of proving that she mattered. In 1948, the Labour government of Clement Attlee created the National Health Service. Free healthcare for all, funded by taxation. It was the greatest social reform of the 20th century, a revolution in the relationship between the state and its citizens, and it destroyed Almina's business model overnight. Why would anyone pay for a private nursing home, however elegant, when the state would treat them for nothing? The wealthy still had their reasons, but the pool of patients willing to pay Almina's fees shrank to almost nothing. The nursing home was already barely viable. The NACE made it impossible. The nursing home closed, the income stopped, the debts remained, creditors pressed their claims, bills accumulated. The woman who had once written checks for tens of thousands of pounds found herself unable to pay for groceries. In 1951, Almina was declared bankrupt. She was 75 years old. The woman who had commanded one of the greatest houses in England, who had hosted kings and funded the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, who had saved soldiers' lives and squandered a Rothschild fortune, was left with nothing. Her assets were seized. Her possessions were sold. When the process was complete, she was allocated £60 a month. That was the price of Almina's lifetime. £60 a month. A footman at the old Highclere had earned £20 a year. Almina, in bankruptcy, earned 3 times a footman's wage. After 56 years and millions of pounds, that was what remained. Chapter 10. The terraced house in Bristol. Her grandson bought her a 3-bedroom house in Redland, and for 15 years, it was the whole of her world. 19 Hampton Road was a neat Victorian terraced house on a quiet street in a respectable suburb of Bristol. It had a front door that opened onto the pavement. It had a small garden at the back. It had neighbors who did not know and would not have believed that the tiny old woman next door had once ruled 5,000 acres of Hampshire parkland and dined with King Edward VII. Her grandson, the future 7th Earl of Carnarvon, had taken pity. The family relationship was complicated, strained by years of financial argument and social disgrace. But blood, in the end, proved thicker than resentment, and the house in Redland was the family's quiet act of mercy. Almina settled into her diminished life with a resilience that was entirely characteristic. She was not broken. She was reduced, which is a different thing. The woman who had terrorized servants at Highclere now managed a single housekeeper. The woman who had thrown house parties for 50 now gossiped on the telephone for hours, connecting with the dwindling circle of people who still remembered the old world. She kept up appearances. She dressed well, within her means. She maintained the erect posture and imperious manner of a woman who had once commanded a castle. Visitors to Hampton Road found a tiny, fierce, immaculately groomed old lady who spoke of the past with a mixture of pride and evasion. She would talk about Egypt, about the war hospital, about the house parties of the Golden Age. She was less forthcoming about the trial, the bankruptcy, and the decades of financial catastrophe that had brought her to this quiet street. She had a companion. His initials were JTS. The historical record is discreet about his full identity, but he lived with Almina at Hampton Road for years. He provided company, stability, and perhaps something warmer. Their arrangement was domestic and apparently contented. For a woman who had made 2 disastrous marriages, a quiet companionship without the complications of legal union may have been, at last, the right choice. When JTS died in 1963, Almina discovered that he had been conducting an affair with the housekeeper's sister. Even in her 80s, the old capacity for domestic drama had not deserted her. Betrayal followed her like weather. She cadged money for holidays. She wrote letters to old friends asking for small sums, the kind of letters that would have been unthinkable to the woman who once tipped servants with gold sovereigns. She complained about the cold. Bristol winters are damp and gray, a world away from the sun of Egypt and the warm fires of Highclere. She followed the news of Highclere from a distance, watching the castle she had transformed pass through the hands of her descendants. The 6th Earl, her son Henry, managed the estate with a prudence that Almina had never possessed. He sold land, cut costs, and kept the house standing through the demolition years when so many of its peers fell. He died in 1987. The 7th Earl continued the fight. Almina outlived most of the people who had known her in her prime. The Edwardian world was gone. The servants were gone. The house parties were gone. The Egyptian winters, the Mayfair seasons, the bustle of Portland Place, all of it had dissolved into memory and then into silence. She was the last witness to a world that had ceased to exist, and nobody was very interested in her testimony. On the 8th of May 1969, Almina sat down to eat a chicken stew. A piece of gristle lodged in her throat. She could not clear it. An ambulance was called. She was taken to Frenchay Hospital, the local National Health Service facility, the very kind of public institution that had destroyed her private nursing home 20 years earlier. She died there. She was 93 years old. The Pocket Venus, born in Mayfair with a false name, married to an earl with Rothschild money, mistress of one of the greatest houses in England, patron of the greatest archaeological discovery of the century, war heroine. Adulteress, bankrupt, dead in a Bristol hospital, choking on a stew. No screenwriter could have written that ending. It was too cruel, too mundane, and too precisely ironic. The woman who had served 8-course dinners to royalty, who had insisted on down pillows for wounded soldiers and crushed strawberry pink for her nurses, killed by a piece of gristle in a 3-bedroom terrace. She was buried without ceremony. The papers gave her a few lines. The world had moved on. Chapter 11, the house that refused to die. By 2009, Highclere Castle needed £12 million in repairs, and more than 50 rooms were uninhabitable. The house that Almina had electrified, modernized, and filled with the laughter of Edwardian England was falling apart. The roof leaked. The stonework crumbled. Dry rot ate through the timbers. The staterooms were intact, preserved through decades of careful maintenance by the family, but behind the public facade, room after room had been abandoned to damp, decay, and the slow entropy that destroys every building that cannot afford its own survival. Highclere was not alone in its suffering. The 20th century had been a killing ground for English country houses. Between the 1950s and the 1970s, one country house was demolished every 5 days. Over 1,000 historic houses were destroyed, torn down by families who could not afford the repairs, the heating, the staff, or the taxes. Whole worlds vanished. Libraries were burned. Gardens were plowed under. Estates that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble and memory. The causes were systemic and relentless. Death duties, introduced in 1894 at a maximum rate of 8%, had risen by 1949 to 80% on the largest estates. Each generation that died triggered a fresh tax bill that forced the sale of land, art, furniture, and sometimes the house itself. Families who had held estates for 500 years found themselves choosing between selling the Rembrandts or selling the roof. Many sold both and still could not pay. The agricultural depression removed the income. The servant crisis removed the workforce. The welfare state removed the social structure that had justified the existence of a ruling class housed in palaces. And the planning laws of the post-war era, which should have protected these buildings, instead made it easier to demolish them than to repurpose them. A listed building could not be modernized without permission, but it could be knocked down with a stroke of a pen. The roll call of the lost is heartbreaking. Stowe, gutted and sold to a school. Eaton Hall, demolished and rebuilt. Clumber Park, razed entirely. Hamilton Palace, the largest non-royal residence in Britain, pulled down stone by stone. Hundreds of houses, each one a repository of art, architecture, and local history, reduced to rubble because nobody could afford to keep them standing. Highclere survived, but only just. The family sold land. They sold paintings. They opened the house to visitors. They diversified. Each generation fought the same battle against the same forces, and each generation made just enough to keep the house standing for the next. Then, in 2010, a television crew arrived. Downton Abbey was the creation of Julian Fellowes, a man who understood the English country house with the intimacy of someone who had grown up in its world. He chose Highclere as the setting for his fictional drama about the Crawley family, and in doing so, he saved the house. The irony was extraordinary. A fictional countess, Lady Grantham, brought millions of viewers to the house of a real countess, Almina, whose story was wilder, sadder, and more astonishing than anything a screenwriter could invent. The show ran for 6 series and spawned 2 feature films. Highclere became one of the most recognizable houses in the world. The tourism economy transformed the estate's finances. Visitors paid to tour the staterooms, walk the gardens, and stand in the library where Maggie Smith had delivered her devastating one-liners. The 8th Earl and Countess of Carnarvon managed the operation with a combination of aristocratic grace and commercial pragmatism that Almina would have recognized, if not entirely approved. The repairs began. The £12 million trickled in through ticket sales, corporate events, gift shop revenue, and the steady, reliable income of a heritage attraction in the age of mass tourism. Rooms were restored. Roofs were repaired. The house, slowly, came back to life. But the fragility remained. The pandemic of 2020 proved how quickly the income could vanish. When the visitors stopped coming, the bills did not stop arriving. The house that had survived death duties, 2 world wars, agricultural collapse, and the demolition wave of the 1950s discovered that it could be threatened just as effectively by a virus and a lockdown. Highclere endures. It endures not because the system supports it, but because individual families, generation after generation, have chosen to fight for it. The fight is exhausting, expensive, and never finished. But the house still stands. The roof, patched and repatched, still keeps out the rain. The gardens still bloom. And the tourists still come, drawn by a television show about a world that never existed, to see a house whose real story is stranger than any fiction. Chapter 12. The price of belonging. The aristocracy was never as closed as it pretended to be, and the door always opened for those who brought enough money. This is the secret at the heart of the English class system, and it is the secret at the heart of Almina's life. The system presented itself as a fortress of lineage and breeding, a world you were born into or forever excluded from. But in practice, it was a market. Titles could be bought, estates could be funded, bloodlines could be refreshed with new money, new energy, and new names, as long as the cheque was large enough to cover the entry fee. Almina was not the first outsider to buy her way in, and she was not the last. The history of the English aristocracy is a history of strategic marriages between old titles and new money. From the American heiress invasion of the Gilded Age to the merchant families of the Industrial Revolution who swapped factory profits for coronets. The system consumed these newcomers. It took their money, gave them a title, and then judged them by standards they could never quite meet, because the standards were designed to be unattainable by anyone who had not been born inside the walls. Almina played the game better than most. She was a brilliant hostess, a bold modernizer, a genuine war heroine. She transformed Highclere from a struggling estate into a center of power and glamour. She funded the most famous archaeological discovery in history. She saved lives. She was brave, generous, impossible, and magnificent. And none of it was enough. The system took her money and then punished her for having bought her way in. When the Dennis-Toon trial exposed her, the doors closed with a speed that proved they had never truly been open. The aristocracy that had accepted her hospitality for 30 years dropped her in 17 days. She had been tolerated, not accepted. Welcomed, not embraced. The difference only became apparent when the welcome was withdrawn. Was she a victim? In part, yes, the system was rigged against outsiders. The rules were designed to ensure that money could buy entry but not permanence, that the newcomer would always be one scandal away from expulsion, while the born insider could survive almost anything. Almina's illegitimate birth, the lie on her birth certificate, the Rothschild name that could never be spoken, these were marks she could never erase, no matter how many kings she entertained or how many soldiers she healed. But Almina was also the architect of her own downfall. Nobody forced her to marry Dennistown. Nobody forced her to fight the court case. Nobody forced her to spend money she did not have on causes she could not afford. Her generosity was real, but so was her recklessness. Her compassion was genuine, but so was her vanity. She was not simply consumed by the system. She ran towards the fire with her arms open, again and again, because the warmth of belonging was the only thing that made her feel alive. What does it mean that the woman who bankrolled the discovery of Tutankhamun died choking on a chicken stew in a terraced house in Bristol? It means that money can buy a castle, but not a home. It means that status granted can always be revoked. It means that the English class system, for all its velvet courtesy, is a machine designed to extract wealth from outsiders and return nothing but the illusion of permanence. Almina spent her whole life paying the price of belonging, the birth certificate that named the wrong father, the £500,000 dowry, the castle she modernized, the hospital she funded, the tomb she paid for, the scandal she endured, the nursing homes she ran, the bankruptcy she suffered. Every chapter of her life was another installment in a debt that could never be settled, because the debt was not financial. It was existential. She was paying for the right to exist in a world that had never intended to include her. She paid. She paid. She kept paying until there was nothing left. And then she died in a terraced house with a piece of gristle in her throat and a lifetime of extraordinary, reckless, magnificent defiance behind her. They called her the Pocket Venus. She was 5 feet tall. She shook